Hey everyone. Tonight we begin with the peculiar, slow-motion collapse into death of Henry VIII, the Tudor titan whose life was filled with wives, wars, and highly questionable decisions involving axes. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. At the height of his reign, Henry VIII was the golden boy of Renaissance England. Tall, broad-shouldered, athletic, and by all accounts, an absolute heartthrob in tights. Fast forward to his final years, and you'd be forgiven for mistaking him for a heavily decorated armchair with anger issues. By the 1540s, Henry had entered what historians politely call his decline. He had ballooned to over 300 pounds, mostly in the midsection, and was suffering from a delightful cocktail of health problems that included chronic leg ulcers, gout, and the general side effects of eating like meat was about to be banned. His transformation from prince to pudding was so dramatic it deserves its own Greek tragedy, complete with gravy. This wasn't just your standard royal overindulgence. Henry was in a lot of pain. Every joint ached, his ulcerated legs throbbed constantly, and smelled like something you wouldn't serve even at a 14th century tavern. He couldn't climb stairs, ride a horse, or even walk unassisted. His once magnificent codpiece now served mainly as a barrier between him and reality. And yet, the image of the glorious king had to be maintained. Portraits continued to depict him as virile and broad-shouldered, with eyes that conveyed divine purpose, rather than indicating that he had been sitting in his chair so long his armor had fused to him. His tailor struggled to keep up. One report claims that his last suit of armor required a waist measurement of 54 inches, and that's being generous. Behind the velvet and jewels, he was rotting slowly, publicly, and with a considerable budget. Courtiers avoided standing too close. Servants prayed not to be assigned foot duty. His doctors tried everything from lancing to poultices, but most remedies had the same results: expensive linen soaked in royal ooze. By the end of his life, Henry VIII's most famous feature wasn't his beard, his codpiece, or even his wedding track record. It was his legs, or more precisely, what had happened to them. What began as minor injuries from a jousting accident in his 30s developed into what can only be described as royal horror. His legs became plagued by chronic ulcers, deep, festering wounds that refused to heal and constantly leaked fluid. Imagine trying to run a kingdom while sitting on top of a pair of infected meat sacks. That was Henry's day-to-day existence. The sores weren't just painful, they were legendary. Visitors commented on the smell from across the room. Ambassadors dreaded court audiences, not because of politics, but because they didn't want to breathe near his ankles. It said the ulcers were so deep you could see bone. The word ooze features heavily in letters of the time. If Shakespeare had written body horror, this would have been Act 1. Naturally, the best medical minds of the 16th century were brought in, which is another way of saying they slapped herbs on it and hoped for divine intervention. Treatments included poultices made of honey, rose oil, and whatever else sounded vaguely church-approved. They also tried cauterization. Yes, burning the wounds closed, which Henry did not enjoy, understandably. And then there was the lancing. Oh, the lancing, a daily ritual of draining the wounds with blades and cloths. Imagine being a physician who has to show up every morning and say, "Good morning, Your Majesty. I'm here to stab your legs again." There's a reason so many court doctors died young, probably of trauma. The ulcers also made it nearly impossible for Henry to exercise, which combined with his famously rich diet, created a feedback loop of decline. More weight meant more pressure on the wounds, more pressure meant more pain meant more mood swings, and more mood swings meant someone nearby was probably getting fired, exiled, or worse, remarried. If you've ever wondered what would happen if a man tried to eat his way into sainthood or out of reality, then look no further than Henry VIII's daily menu. His meals weren't just excessive, they were borderline weaponized. Breakfast alone could involve several eggs, hunks of beef, white bread soaked in ale, and possibly a roasted partridge just to get the digestion going. Fruit and vegetables? Not unless they were used as decoration or accidentally fell onto the roast. The Tudor court equated meat with masculinity. The more flesh on your plate, the more divine your rule. And Henry, bless him, took that as a personal challenge. Roasted swan, venison, lamb, eel pies, game birds, all coated in gravy, sauce, or symbolic meaning. If it once breathed, he ate it. If it didn't, it was probably used to thicken something that did. His favorite indulgence, red wine, gallons of it daily. Water was for peasants and washing out wounds, not for kings. By the end, his body was likely 60% Cabernet. Now let's talk portion size. His meals were prepared in enormous quantities, not just for him, but for an entire royal household of taste testers, servers, musicians, and whatever group he was in favor of that week. But even factoring in the entourage, Henry ate like every meal might be interrupted by death. Spoiler, one eventually was. This high-fat, low-vegetable, high-gout diet naturally took its toll. Aside from the infamous ulcers, his digestion was known to be volatile. Royal physicians regularly noted his bloating, discomfort, and let's say, audible distress. You could probably time your pocket watch to one of his post-feast groans echoing through Whitehall. And still, Henry refused to change. By the final years of his reign, he could barely chew with his rotting teeth, but he still insisted on massive portions at banquets. Food had to be pre-cut so he wouldn't tire himself. Even lifting a turkey leg was becoming an aerobic activity. There comes a point in every overindulgent monarch's life when gravity wins. For Henry VIII, that moment arrived sometime in his mid-40s, though it didn't knock politely. It arrived with a full marching band of gout, obesity, and increasingly irritated ulcers. By then, Henry had grown so large and immobile that his body required logistical planning. Gone were the glory days of jousting tournaments and athletic struts around court. Now getting him out of bed involved multiple attendants, pulleys, and something akin to emotional bribery. He didn't walk so much as was moved. Royal engineers reportedly designed a mechanical chair, something between a reinforced wheelchair and a throne on training wheels, to transport him through his palaces. His armor was custom-fitted not for battle, but to support the sheer bulk of royal volume. You could have lost a courtier inside one of his sleeves. Mounting a horse? Forget it. They had to build a hoist system, yes, a literal crane for kings, just to lift him into the saddle, and even then the horse likely re-evaluated its career choices. Exercise, once considered noble, had become mythical. His only form of movement was turning to yell at someone, and even that required effort. His doctors encouraged gentle motion, like walking a few steps per day, but Henry preferred political executions over physical exertion. It burned fewer calories but did wonders for morale. This physical decline wasn't just inconvenient, it was dangerous. Inactivity worsened everything: his circulation, his mood, his already hostile digestive system. And when you're a monarch, your health becomes everyone's problem. Entire days were scheduled around how far he could be rolled. Even court ceremonies had to be shortened. State functions were planned to keep the king seated for as long as possible. If the throne room had hosted a treadmill, it would have been purely symbolic, or used to power a spit roast. Yet no one dared say it aloud that the most powerful man in England was quite literally weighed down by his own choices. Of all the indignities that accompany royal decay, few are as memorable or as difficult to politely ignore as smell. And Henry VIII, in his final years, had an aroma that reportedly arrived before he did. Now, body odor wasn't exactly rare in Tudor England. This was a time when bathing was more theory than practice. Perfume was considered healthcare, and the most effective deodorant was standing downwind. But even by 16th century standards, Henry's scent was remarkable. The culprit, his infamous leg ulcers. These weren't just minor wounds, they were cavernous, festering, constantly draining infections wrapped in silk stockings and denial. The royal physicians did what they could: honey dressings, herbal compresses, repeated lancing. But there's only so much you can do when the king's lower limbs are threatening to declare independence. The result was a lingering, acrid stench that haunted palace corridors. Courtiers were known to subtly back away mid-conversation. Ambassadors reportedly endured meetings while holding perfumed cloths to their faces, the Renaissance equivalent of tactical air support. And then there was the matter of his general hygiene. With movement nearly impossible and pain constant, regular bathing fell off the schedule. Instead, Henry relied on powders, oils, and layers upon layers of rich fabrics designed to absorb shame. He essentially mummified himself in velvet and linen, hoping no one would notice what was rotting underneath. Spoiler, they noticed. Even his own clothing was sacrificed. It said his garments had to be burned after use, not washed. A fitting metaphor for how much of his dignity was now considered disposable. Despite all this, no one dared speak of it in his presence. If you so much as wrinkled your nose in the wrong direction, you might find yourself reassigned to the Tower of London, or worse, tasked with changing his bandages. And yes, that was an actual job. Historians don't know their names, but we all owe them a moment of silence. It's hard enough being a monarch. It's harder still when you're in constant pain, oozing from multiple orifices and slowly sinking into your own furniture. By the end of his reign, Henry VIII wasn't just physically immobile, he was emotionally volatile. One minute he was weeping over his dead wife Jane Seymour's memory, the next he was accusing someone of treason for blinking too loudly. His court lived in a constant state of psychological whiplash. Servants learned to interpret the tilt of his eyebrows the way sailors read clouds before a storm. He's frowning, that's either constipation or war. Of course, Henry hadn't always been like this. Earlier in life, he'd been charismatic, intelligent, even playful. But as the ulcers deepened, so did the mood swings. The Henry of old had been replaced by something more unpredictable, a king whose primary foreign policy tool was rage. Medical historians suspect that alongside his physical ailments, he may have suffered from untreated depression, chronic pain-induced irritability, and possibly head trauma from a 1536 jousting accident. But in 16th century England, the go-to treatment for a bad mood was prayer, leeches, or blaming the French. Unfortunately, being king meant no one could tell him to take a break. Instead, advisors smiled nervously and agreed with whatever he said. Some even praised his divinely inspired fury, which is a nice way of saying, "We'd like to keep our necks, please." The results were messy. Dozens of courtiers were exiled, imprisoned, or executed simply for falling out of favor during one of Henry's mood hurricanes. Even his longtime friend and Chancellor Thomas More wasn't spared, proving that Henry's inner circle was shaped more like a revolving door. By January of the year 1547, everyone in the royal court could see the end coming, except notably Henry VIII. He was in every way falling apart, but you couldn't legally say so under Tudor law. Predicting the king's death was treason, which made royal physicians the most anxious, overqualified actors in history. Henry was confined to bed, not just bedridden, but bed-dwelling. He hadn't walked in weeks, hadn't ridden in years, and spent his final days ruling England from beneath a mountain of embroidered cushions and questionable decisions. His legs were swollen, his breathing was labored, his appetite was reduced. Well, by Tudor standards, he was still eating like someone who didn't realize his will was about to be the most important document in the country. Despite his obvious state, no one dared utter the word dying. Courtiers developed a whole glossary of euphemisms. He is resting deeply. His Majesty is in a reflective mood. The king is simply digesting vigorously. Even his doctors tiptoed around the subject. One physician reportedly declared, "His Majesty shall recover, God willing." A safe statement, vague, non-committal, and with divine backup. Meanwhile, said Majesty was drifting in and out of consciousness, probably hallucinating about roast goose and Protestant diplomacy. But even in his decline, Henry VIII still had paperwork to finish. He signed documents, amended his will, and appointed a regency council for his 9-year-old son, Edward, who would soon be handed the kingdom and a debt the size of France. These weren't the majestic final acts of a noble ruler. They were scribbled commands from a very sick man whose court pretended he was just having a moment. Everyone around him knew the truth. Servants, courtiers, even the rats in the palace floorboards probably sensed something shifting. But still they waited, because the King of England couldn't die until it was safe to say so, and at this stage, no one wanted to go first. As January dragged on, Henry VIII hovered somewhere between lucidity and royal delirium. His body was shutting down, but his mind still had policies to bark out, people to snub, and a country to pretend he wasn't dying in front of. The denial was thick, possibly thicker than his ankles. He gave no formal confession, no emotional farewell, no cinematic final words. Instead, he issued instructions, edits to the will, tweaks to the Regency Council, and the usual paranoid rearranging of power players, just in case any of them got funny ideas after his eventual and definitely not impending death. Most notably, he finalized the succession plan. His sickly 9-year-old son, Edward, would take the throne, flanked by a hand-picked group of advisors. These men, it should be noted, had roughly the loyalty and backstabbing tendencies of a barrel full of Tudor eels. Henry also ordered that his tomb be completed, a grand structure he'd been planning for decades. Spoiler, it never got finished. For all his micromanaging and power hoarding, the thing that outlasted him was paperwork. As for religion, he managed to keep things impressively ambiguous. England was still Protestantish, but not too Protestant. Just Protestant enough to upset Rome without committing to anything doctrinal. It was the ecclesiastical equivalent of muttering something under your breath and walking away quickly. Even in his final days, Henry refused to acknowledge just how close the end was. When priests asked if he'd like to make peace with God, he dodged them like a man avoiding jury duty. One account suggests he eventually whispered, "All is lost." But even then, the court wasn't sure if he meant his soul, the kingdom, or just a misplaced turkey leg. Meanwhile, the palace operated under a strict "don't say he's dying" policy. If anyone was caught using phrases like last rites or funeral preparations, they were swiftly removed, not for disrespect, but for ruining the illusion that England's most powerful monarch wasn't dissolving in his own bed. In the grand tradition of royal drama, you'd expect Henry VIII to deliver a stirring deathbed confession, a Shakespearean monologue about sins, regrets, and the 6 wives he either married, murdered, or misplaced. Instead, we got silence, or worse, administrative clarity. There were priests at his bedside, yes, but they were mostly ornamental. Henry, who had rebranded the entire Church of England just so he could annul a marriage and flirt with theology on his own terms, was suddenly very quiet about his spiritual affairs. No dramatic plea for forgiveness, no humble repentance, no "sorry about that whole beheading your mother" chat with his daughter Mary. Perhaps he thought he had nothing to confess. After all, this was a man who believed God had personally endorsed his every decision, even the messier ones. From his point of view, he hadn't failed morally. He had just been chronically misunderstood by papists and wives with annoying survival instincts. According to one report, Archbishop Thomas Cranmer arrived in time to ask if the king still trusted in Christ. Henry VIII, barely conscious, supposedly squeezed his hand, a gesture open to interpretation. Was it affirmation? Was it a muscle spasm? Was he simply annoyed the archbishop hadn't brought wine? That squeeze would be the closest thing he ever gave to a final confession. For a man obsessed with control, it's telling that his final hours were filled not with reflection, but with paperwork, delegation, and vague gestures at spiritual matters. While other kings died repenting, Henry died reallocating. And while he had once described himself as the supreme head on earth of the Church of England, he now faced death with no more ceremony than a nod and a hand twitch. Divine authority apparently did not include an exit interview. But maybe that was the most Henry way to go. No apologies, no weeping monks, just the slow, steady decline of a man who always preferred the sound of his own laws to the echo of his conscience. And so passed Henry VIII, with no dramatic final words, no poetic closure, and absolutely no indication that he thought anything had gone wrong. When Henry VIII finally stopped breathing on January 28, 1547, the room didn't erupt into mourning or solemn proclamations. It sort of paused, then stood around awkwardly, then quietly panicked. Because here's the thing, it was illegal to declare the king dead without very specific authorization under Tudor law. To suggest the monarch had died, even if he was visibly deceased, was technically treason, which meant everyone in the room suddenly became deeply interested in pretending Henry VIII was simply resting, possibly very deeply and permanently. Doctors, courtiers, and clergymen all stared at each other, waiting for someone to blink first. No one did. There was no press release, no moment of national mourning, no trumpets, just the heavy silence of men thinking, well, now what? Eventually, they agreed to say nothing for several days, not out of respect, but strategy. The succession still needed to be managed, the council assembled, and most importantly, the 9-year-old heir, Edward, informed that he now technically owned everything in England, including some very angry neighbors. In the meantime, Henry VIII's body remained in Whitehall Palace, still king in title, but now more biologically aspirational. Ministers quietly arranged his affairs while pretending he was still unavailable, which wasn't a lie, just a spectacular understatement. And while no one spoke the word dead, palace staff began making preparations with all the subtlety of a Shakespearean farce. Mourning clothes were quietly ordered, seals were altered. Some opportunists probably started dusting off family trees to prove they were technically 12th cousins to the boy king, and thus deserved land. Even foreign ambassadors weren't told right away. Diplomats from France and the Holy Roman Empire were still negotiating with courtiers who smiled through clenched teeth, hoping no one noticed the faint scent of royal decomposition wafting through the velvet drapes. The entire nation was being led by a man who, as far as the law was concerned, was still alive, just unusually quiet, not currently moving, and about to need a very large coffin. Once Henry VIII was officially, if not immediately, dead, the royal handlers faced a new and urgent dilemma: what to do with the body. And unfortunately for everyone involved, the body had opinions of its own, mostly involving decomposition. Let's be blunt, the man was enormous. He weighed somewhere north of 300 pounds, and not a trim, symmetrical 300, more of a melting noble pudding shape. His body was riddled with infections, ulcers, and years of aggressive Tudor eating, so naturally it began breaking down faster than expected, much faster. In the chilly halls of Whitehall Palace, servants and embalmers scrambled to preserve the king, but this wasn't the golden age of refrigeration. Embalming methods were rudimentary, consisting of stuffing the corpse with spices and wrapping it in layers of cloth like a royal lasagna. The hope was that cinnamon and cloves would overpower the scent of decay. Spoiler, they didn't. Despite their best efforts, the body began to leak, slowly at first, then alarmingly. A mixture of bodily fluids seeped through the coffin, causing discomfort, confusion, and eventually widespread nausea. It got so bad that during the funeral procession to Windsor, the coffin reportedly emitted a dark stain and smell so potent that it startled the horses and, in one now infamous account, attracted stray dogs. Yes, dogs licking the drippings from the former head of the Church of England, which is probably not how he imagined his legacy being honored. To make matters worse, the coffin had been sealed hastily. Royal urgency overrode craftsmanship. It swelled from internal gases and allegedly cracked. The Tudor version of Tupperware, it was not. Everyone involved tried to keep a straight face. Mourning nobles walked beside the oozing coffin with the dignity of people pretending they couldn't smell anything. And no one, absolutely no one, brought it up in conversation afterward. It's not every day a monarch's corpse makes headlines centuries later for the way it malfunctioned. But then again, Henry VIII was never one to do things quietly. Not in life, and certainly not in death. As the funeral procession moved toward Windsor Castle, the sealed wooden coffin carrying the late king rumbled ominously. Now, you'd think transporting the body of England's most iconic monarch would involve some kind of dignified, marble-lined container, or at the very least one that didn't behave like an overripe meat barrel. But alas, haste and biology conspired to make this final journey unforgettable for all the wrong reasons. The coffin began to leak, not metaphorically, literally. Despite efforts to embalm the body, the combination of heat, internal gases, poor sealing, and sheer mass caused the coffin to sweat. And by sweat, we mean ooze. Contemporary chroniclers describe a black, putrid fluid leaking from the base of the coffin during a stopover at Sion Abbey, the kind of detail you don't soon forget, even if you desperately wish you could. It gets worse. One popular, if possibly apocryphal, account claims dogs were seen licking the fluid beneath the coffin. Imagine it, a royal procession halted in solemn silence, mourning nobles dressed in black, all while a couple of opportunistic hounds enthusiastically sample what is, by all accounts, the king. Tudor England had many rituals, but canine consumption was not supposed to be part of state funerals. And yet, no one said a word. The show had to go on. The coffin was cleaned as discreetly as possible. Everyone resumed walking, eyes forward, mouths shut, noses offended. This wasn't just an embarrassing leak. It became legend, a dark little parable whispered through the centuries. To some, it was divine retribution for Henry's cruelty. To others, it was a grim punchline to a lifetime of excess. Either way, Henry VIII had managed to do what few monarchs can claim: ruin a funeral with nothing but his presence. There's something deliciously poetic or brutally ironic about where Henry VIII ended up. Not in Westminster Abbey with the other great kings, not in some towering mausoleum of Tudor marble. No, the man who broke with the Catholic Church, who dissolved monasteries, and who declared himself the supreme head of the Church of England, was buried in a humble vault beneath the floor of St. George's Chapel, almost like an afterthought. He was placed next to his true love, Jane Seymour, the one wife who gave him a male heir and died before she could disappoint him. And that's it. No towering monument, no golden tomb, just a slab on the floor that for over a century didn't even bear his name. It was only in the Victorian era that someone added an inscription. Until then, Henry VIII was resting in unmarked anonymity, just a few feet beneath tourist boots and royal ceremonies. Here lies the man who once thundered across Europe with papal bulls in one hand and a turkey leg in the other. The man who decapitated 2 wives, dismantled centuries of religious tradition, and rewrote the spiritual map of England, now buried like a moderately successful merchant. The irony is rich and yet somehow appropriate. After all the grandeur, the power, the ceremonies, and the political tantrums, it's almost fitting that Henry's final destination was quietly humble, even accidental. No glorious tomb commissioned during life, no elaborate effigy, no towering altar to his glory. Just a lead-lined box under a chapel floor, a fading memory in the company of Jane and eventually Charles I, whose own death was, let's say, not subtle. For all his desire to dominate history, Henry VIII ended up in a shared grave with minimal decoration and maximum foot traffic. Valeria Messalina didn't just stumble into the spotlight. She was born in it. A member of the powerful Claudian dynasty, she had imperial blood coursing through her veins. Her great-uncle was Emperor Tiberius, and her cousin would one day become Emperor Nero. In other words, Messalina was born into a family where power plays were more common than family dinners, and everyone had a dagger, if not in their hand, then firmly lodged in their back. She was raised in a Roman world defined by luxury, corruption, and high-stakes politics. It was a place where virtue was praised in public and discarded in private. From early on, Messalina would have understood the rules of this treacherous game. Loyalty was a currency, appearances were everything, and a well-timed affair or alliance could be the difference between exile and elevation. As a teenager, she was married off to her cousin, Tiberius Claudius Drusus, better known to history as Emperor Claudius. At the time, Claudius was seen as an unlikely political figure, awkward, physically impaired, and considered something of a harmless scholar. Few imagined he would ever rise to the throne, but power in Rome had a funny way of landing in unexpected laps. When Claudius suddenly became emperor in the chaos following Caligula's assassination, Messalina, barely in her 20s, became Empress of Rome, and she didn't waste time adjusting to the role. Almost immediately, she began reshaping her image, not as a ceremonial wife, but as a force to be reckoned with. Behind her youthful beauty and public charm was a razor-sharp mind already scheming how to consolidate her position. Rome expected its empress to be a symbol of modesty and grace. Messalina, on the other hand, had ambitions that were anything but modest. She wasn't content with being the woman behind the man. She wanted to be the one pulling the strings, using flattery, sex, alliances, and fear to climb even higher. And in a court where everyone had something to hide, she was fluent in the language of secrets. In the empire's golden halls, where gossip traveled faster than messengers, Valeria Messalina was about to become a legend and a cautionary tale. Rome had seen ambitious women before, but none quite like her. Once crowned empress, Valeria Messalina swiftly became one of the most influential women in Rome, not because of her title alone, but because of how she used it. She didn't just sit quietly beside Claudius in the imperial court. She was the one whispering in his ear, nudging decisions, arranging marriages, forging alliances, and eliminating enemies, all while pretending to be the loyal wife. But her influence wasn't just political. Messalina was infamous for something else entirely: her alleged sexual appetite. Ancient sources, mostly written by men with axes to grind, paint her as Rome's most depraved femme fatale. Tacitus, Suetonius, and Juvenal all gleefully described how she supposedly snuck out of the palace at night to work incognito in brothels, competing with prostitutes and returning before dawn. Whether these tales were fact or slander, one thing is clear: Messalina's reputation was unlike any other empress before or since. Behind every rumor was a strategy. Her lovers weren't always chosen for pleasure. Many were powerful men, senators, equestrians, noble heirs. Messalina used intimacy the way other politicians used bribes. Sleep with her and you might find yourself promoted. Cross her and you might find yourself mysteriously exiled, or worse. Claudius, meanwhile, remained either blissfully unaware or willfully ignorant. His reign was full of distractions: administrative reforms, political infighting, and his own insecurities as an underestimated ruler. Some historians suggest that Messalina manipulated Claudius by playing the role of the innocent wife, concerned, devoted, protective. Others think he simply didn't want to know. After all, the truth would have shattered the illusion of control he had over his court and his marriage. But Rome knew. The whispers in the forums, the jokes in the bathhouses, the snide comments from rival nobles. Messalina's escapades were legendary. And while her name became synonymous with excess and lust, she still held an iron grip on power. That contradiction, scandalous yet untouchable, made her even more dangerous. She blurred the line between seduction and politics, turning her body into a weapon and her bedroom into a war room. Rome's elite either feared her or fell for her, sometimes both. Still, as with all unchecked power, the walls would not hold forever, and the higher Messalina climbed, the more unstable the empire beneath her feet became. Messalina's reign as empress wasn't just defined by scandal, it was also a masterclass in manipulation. She understood the game of Roman politics intimately and played it with terrifying efficiency. Her targets weren't always her lovers. More often, they were threats, rivals, critics, or anyone who dared to challenge her position as the imperial queen-maker. And she was ruthless. One of her favorite tactics was the false accusation. With Claudius often distracted or passive, Messalina could orchestrate the downfall of anyone by simply whispering a well-placed lie. She accused powerful senators of conspiracy, wives of adultery, and noble women of insolence. Many ended up exiled, executed, or forced to take their own lives, their crime being inconvenient. She didn't operate alone. Messalina had allies: corrupt freedmen, informants, and sycophantic magistrates who owed their positions to her favor. These cronies helped carry out her purges, blackmailed the vulnerable, and ensured that her enemies were destroyed before they could react. Claudius, ever the detached ruler, often signed their death warrants without realizing he was removing loyal men who might have warned him of the storm building at his doorstep. Her most notorious manipulation, though, was deeply personal. When Claudius married Messalina, he was in his 50s and she was in her early 20s. That age gap created a power dynamic ripe for exploitation. She weaponized her youth, charm, and beauty to maintain a facade of domestic loyalty. Claudius, known for being affectionate with her in public, believed he had a devoted wife. But in private, Messalina used that trust like a dagger behind his back. She also secured her position by bearing Claudius a son, Britannicus. That made her not just empress, but mother to the imperial heir. It was a powerful shield, one that discouraged even the boldest of Claudius's advisors from speaking ill of her. Who would dare insult the mother of Rome's future? But the web she wove was tightening. The number of enemies she made was growing. Even her allies, fat on imperial spoils, started whispering about her recklessness. A court built on blackmail and fear can only last so long before it turns on itself. Messalina didn't notice or refused to notice that her empire of secrets was beginning to rot from within, and the people she had crushed on her way up, they were waiting quietly, patiently. In the cutthroat theater of Roman power, no queen sits unchallenged for long. Messalina's enemies were numerous, but one of the most dangerous threats to her position wasn't a scheming senator or a bitter noblewoman. It was a freedman named Narcissus, and he wasn't alone. Narcissus, a former slave turned trusted secretary to Claudius, wielded immense influence behind the scenes. He managed imperial correspondence, controlled access to the emperor, and most importantly, had Claudius's ear in ways few others did. For years, Narcissus tolerated Messalina's antics, perhaps even profited from them, but eventually even he began to see the danger she posed, not just to the emperor's reputation, but to the very stability of the empire. Tensions reached new heights when Messalina's ambition began to grow teeth. No longer content with manipulating from behind the curtain, she started plotting something far more audacious, replacing Claudius entirely. Some sources claim that Messalina began an affair with the handsome senator Gaius Silius, not just another lover, but a calculated partner in a quiet coup. Silius was wealthy, influential, and dangerously popular, and Messalina didn't just want him in her bed, she wanted him on the throne. According to the ancient historian Tacitus, Messalina even went so far as to marry Silius in a public ceremony while Claudius was still emperor, a move that was either madness or genius, depending on how successful she believed her scheme would be. It was the boldest political play of her life, but it was also the one that would break her. When Narcissus learned of the marriage, he was stunned. He knew Claudius to be slow to act, but even he couldn't ignore a betrayal of this scale. Narcissus had two options: report it and risk being ignored, or take matters into his own hands. He chose the latter. With speed and secrecy, Narcissus set a trap. He gathered evidence, alerted the Praetorian Guard, and prepared a case so damning that even Claudius couldn't look the other way. The imperial court was about to implode. The empress, who had ruled with whispers, lust, and lies, had finally made a misstep too grand to conceal, and now the knives she once turned on others were being sharpened against her. The rival had returned, and this time he was coming for her crown. For years, Claudius had been underestimated, not just by Rome but by his own wife. Seen as weak, bookish, and easily manipulated, he was the perfect husband for a scheming empress like Messalina. But betrayal on this scale, an alleged marriage to another man, was too massive to ignore, even for Claudius. When Narcissus finally approached the emperor with the damning news, Claudius's initial reaction was disbelief. His beloved wife, the mother of his son, had married another man in broad daylight. Narcissus didn't just tell him, he showed him documents, witnesses, the ceremony itself. The emperor was stunned and finally furious. This was no longer palace gossip, this was treason. Claudius, long thought too slow-witted to rule, acted with uncharacteristic decisiveness. With Narcissus as his guide, he handed emergency powers to the freedman and instructed him to clean house. The Praetorian Guard, Rome's elite soldiers, was mobilized not to defend Messalina but to destroy her. While Claudius returned to the palace, silent and pale, Narcissus moved quickly. Gaius Silius, caught mid-celebration, was dragged into the street and executed without trial. His allies, those who had lent support to the coup or had simply known too much, were rounded up and eliminated in a brutal sweep of political house-cleaning. As for Messalina, she didn't run, she didn't hide. In a strange, almost tragic twist, she believed right until the end that Claudius would forgive her, that her beauty, her charm, her role as mother of his heir would save her once again. She even fled to the gardens of Lucullus, begging for a chance to speak with him, to explain. But Claudius wasn't listening anymore. The man she had treated like a puppet had finally cut his strings. At first, Claudius hesitated to order her death. Despite everything, he still seemed torn. But Narcissus, fearing that Claudius might waver, acted first. He sent a centurion with a dagger and a message: die with dignity, or be dragged through the forum in disgrace. Messalina, uncharacteristically paralyzed by fear, tried to stall. She took the dagger, but couldn't bring herself to use it. In the end, the centurion had to do it for her. The empress, who had controlled Rome with seduction and silence, died in a garden, alone, panicked and powerless. And just like that, the most infamous woman in imperial history was gone. With Messalina dead, the imperial court fell into a cold, uneasy silence. It wasn't just the end of a scandal, it was the erasure of an era. Claudius, publicly stoic, ordered that her name be stricken from official records. Statues were pulled down, inscriptions were defaced, documents mentioning her deeds were quietly destroyed or rewritten. Rome was instructed to forget its empress, but how do you forget a woman like Messalina? The city whispered even more now that she was gone. Stories about her final moments circulated like wildfire. Some claimed she cried for Claudius to save her until her last breath. Others said she cursed him, defiant to the end. Either way, her memory refused to vanish as easily as her portraits did. The political cleanup continued. Silius and his supporters were just the beginning. Claudius, now suspicious of everyone, began purging his court with a paranoid edge. Freedmen and officials who had once dined with Messalina were either dismissed, imprisoned, or executed. The Senate, eager to appear loyal, passed motions denouncing her treason, calling it a stain on the empire that had now been righteously cleansed. Only one person remained untouched, Britannicus, Messalina's young son and the heir to the throne. Claudius couldn't bring himself to punish the boy for the sins of his mother. Yet Messalina's death had left a power vacuum, and every ambitious noblewoman in Rome noticed. Behind closed doors, powerful families began maneuvering to replace the fallen empress, and Claudius, emotionally gutted and politically adrift, was more vulnerable than ever. This wasn't a period of healing. It was a reset, a dangerous, unstable calm. Claudius's trust in those around him had shattered, and he became increasingly reliant on his freedmen, especially Narcissus, who now wielded influence so great he practically ruled by proxy. Rome, meanwhile, began rewriting its favorite bedtime story. Messalina wasn't just remembered as an adulterous empress. She became a cautionary tale, a byword for female lust and treachery. Her legend, twisted and magnified, became more powerful in death than she ever was in life. She had been purged from the imperial narrative, but not from the Roman imagination. And while her body was buried in obscurity, her ghost would linger in the shadows of the Palatine Hill, whispered about, laughed at, feared forever. In the wake of Messalina's execution, Claudius found himself in an awkward position. An emperor without an empress, a father with a vulnerable heir, and a court full of power-hungry opportunists. The empire needed a new matron, someone to stabilize the palace and manage the imperial household. But Claudius, still wounded by betrayal, was reluctant to remarry. Enter Agrippina the Younger. She was everything Messalina had been and more. Beautiful, intelligent, calculating, and dangerous in her own right. But unlike Messalina, Agrippina wasn't reckless. She was methodical. Born into the Julio-Claudian dynasty, she was the daughter of Germanicus, the sister of Caligula, and the mother of a boy named Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, later known as Nero. Agrippina saw her chance. She played the long game. Where Messalina had seduced, Agrippina negotiated. She convinced Claudius that marriage to her would restore dignity to the imperial house. She promised loyalty, order, and most importantly, a unified dynasty. Claudius, aging and increasingly manipulated by his inner circle, eventually agreed. Their marriage, though controversial due to their familial connection, was made legal by a special Senate decree. She became the next empress of Rome, but this was no love story. Agrippina wasn't interested in sharing the throne. She wanted to control it. And she quickly began purging any remaining allies of Messalina, ensuring that the old empress's name stayed buried along with her son Britannicus's claim to the throne. She installed her own people in key roles, isolated Claudius from his previous advisors, and began grooming her son Nero as the future emperor. Step by step, she dismantled Messalina's legacy, not just through politics, but through memory. And the Roman people? They watched, bemused. Some whispered that Agrippina was just Messalina with better PR. Others feared she was something far more dangerous. While Messalina had ruled with passion and impulse, Agrippina ruled with calculation and precision. Where Messalina had overplayed her hand, Agrippina never showed hers until it was too late. The empire had traded one empress for another, but whether Rome had learned its lesson was doubtful. Claudius had survived one scheming wife. He wouldn't survive the next. And so the ghost of Messalina didn't fade. It simply changed form, reborn in the ambitions of a new woman rising from her ashes. After Messalina's death, her son Britannicus became a tragic relic of a discarded dynasty. Though still the biological son of Claudius and the rightful heir to the throne, his future now hung by a thread. He was barely a boy when his mother was executed, and suddenly the palace that once celebrated his birth became a gilded cage. Initially, Claudius kept Britannicus close, even assigning him trusted tutors and guards. The emperor still hoped to secure a legacy through his bloodline. But that hope was quietly and efficiently dismantled by Agrippina the Younger, who had no intention of letting Messalina's child sit on the imperial throne. Agrippina's own son Nero was older than Britannicus and far more controllable, especially by her. So she began her campaign to remove Britannicus from the line of succession. She portrayed him as immature, easily manipulated, and unfit to rule. At the same time, she worked tirelessly to elevate Nero. She had him adopted by Claudius, granted the name Nero, Claudius Caesar Drusus Germanicus, and given titles that signaled his path to power. By the time Britannicus reached adolescence, he was no longer Rome's golden boy. He was a prisoner in his own home, watched constantly, his supporters either exiled or silenced. Even his former tutors were replaced with Agrippina's men, ensuring that the young prince grew up under a web of political suspicion and isolation. Claudius, aging and increasingly manipulated, seemed to drift further from his son. He lavished Nero with honors and gradually distanced himself from the memory of Messalina, as if trying to scrub away the shame of his former marriage by erasing their child. Britannicus became a symbol of what could have been, a legitimate heir sidelined by power politics, and he knew it. Ancient sources say he grew bitter, fearful, and watchful. He may have remembered his mother's fall and perhaps even feared the same fate. When Claudius mysteriously died, likely poisoned, possibly by Agrippina, Nero was declared emperor without opposition. Britannicus, now a teenager, was reduced to a threat. A year later, during a banquet, the boy suddenly collapsed and died. The official cause? Epilepsy. The real cause? Poison, administered on Nero's orders according to most ancient sources. Messalina's legacy died with her son, and the imperial line she tried so desperately to secure was extinguished not by battle, but by dinner plate. Valeria Messalina may have died in disgrace, but her story refused to stay buried. In fact, the more the empire tried to forget her, the more immortal she became. Over the centuries, she transformed from a flesh and blood empress into a myth, Rome's ultimate symbol of feminine vice, lust, and betrayal. But was that reputation earned or constructed? The surviving accounts of Messalina's life come almost entirely from hostile sources: Tacitus, Suetonius, and Juvenal, men who had little sympathy for women in power, especially ones who dared to act independently. To them, she wasn't a political player. She was a cautionary tale, a dangerous woman who weaponized her sexuality and corrupted the purity of the empire. They wrote of her alleged midnight visits to brothels, her public marriage to another man, and her endless affairs. But all of these tales bear the tone of moral panic more than credible evidence. Some modern historians have begun to question whether Messalina's infamy was inflated to serve a narrative. After all, powerful women in Rome, especially those who fell from favor, were almost always rewritten as monsters. Think of Cleopatra, think of Agrippina. In a society ruled by patriarchs, an ambitious woman was either a paragon of virtue or a seductress in disguise. Messalina conveniently became the latter. Yet even if we strip away the exaggerations, one truth remains. She held enormous influence in the Roman court. She maneuvered through a deadly political landscape, eliminated rivals, secured her son's claim to the throne, and wielded soft power in a world dominated by men with swords and senates. Whether by manipulation, charm, or fear, she was effective. Her downfall didn't just mark the end of her own story. It altered the shape of Roman succession, paved the way for Agrippina, and ultimately helped Nero rise to power. The echoes of her ambition resonated far beyond her lifetime in literature, art, and popular culture. Messalina became an archetype, the lascivious empress, the femme fatale, the scandal made flesh. But behind the legend may have been a woman caught in a system that punished power in the wrong hands, especially when those hands were manicured and female. Messalina didn't just scandalize an empire. She forced it to confront its fears about women, control, and the cost of influence. And that, more than any affair, was her most dangerous legacy. In the pantheon of America's founding fathers, Alexander Hamilton stands out as a brilliant mind, architect of the nation's financial system, co-author of the Federalist Papers, and a man whose ambition knew no ceiling. But behind the powdered wigs and polished speeches was a man who let his personal life spiral into a mess so spectacular it became the country's first political sex scandal. It all began in 1791. Hamilton was at the peak of his political power. serving as the first Secretary of the Treasury under President George Washington. But while he was balancing national debt by day, his nights took a darker turn. One evening, a young woman named Maria Reynolds appeared at his Philadelphia home, claiming her husband had abandoned her and begging for financial help. Hamilton agreed to assist and soon after began a year-long affair with her. The affair wasn't just personal, it became political. Maria's husband, James Reynolds, discovered the relationship and saw an opportunity. Instead of confronting Hamilton with rage, he chose extortion. For over a year, Hamilton paid Reynolds hush money to keep the affair under wraps. But secrets in politics are like cracks in a dam. Eventually, they burst. By 1797, political enemies, chief among them Jeffersonian Republicans, caught wind of the scandal. Rumors began to swirl that Hamilton was not just guilty of adultery, but of financial corruption, the implication that he had misused government funds to pay off the Reynolds couple. It was a career-destroying allegation. So Hamilton did the unthinkable. He wrote a 95-page confession, known as the Reynolds pamphlet, detailing every sordid moment of the affair in shocking, unapologetic clarity. He confessed to sleeping with Maria, to paying her husband, and to his moral failings, while insisting he had never stolen from the Treasury. The fallout was brutal. Federalists were horrified, his reputation plummeted, and his enemies had a field day. Hamilton was humiliated publicly and politically, losing much of his influence in Washington's inner circle. And yet, in typical Hamilton fashion, he went down swinging. He'd rather be remembered as an adulterer than a thief. It was a gamble that preserved his integrity at the cost of his dignity. In the end, it wasn't a duel or a debate that first cracked the armor of America's boldest founding father. It was lust, blackmail, and one very detailed pamphlet. Thomas Jefferson is often painted as the idealist behind America's Declaration of Independence, the philosopher-president who championed liberty, democracy, and the pursuit of happiness. But behind the neoclassical architecture of Monticello stood a truth Jefferson never acknowledged publicly, a secret family born of bondage. Sally Hemings was an enslaved woman at Jefferson's estate. She was also his late wife's half-sister, the daughter of a white slave owner and a biracial enslaved woman. That twisted irony was not lost on historians. Even more complicated, Hemings was only around 14 years old when Jefferson, in his 40s, likely began his relationship with her during his diplomatic stay in Paris. For decades, this relationship was dismissed as rumor, but oral history passed down by Hemings's descendants told a different story, one of intimacy, secrecy, and children. DNA testing conducted in the late 1990s finally confirmed what many had long suspected. Jefferson fathered at least 6 of Hemings's children, 4 of whom lived to adulthood. Jefferson never freed Sally Hemings. However, he did quietly manumit all of her surviving children. They were the only enslaved individuals he ever freed during his lifetime. Some of them ran away under suspiciously coordinated and overlooked circumstances. Others were officially emancipated in his will. Each of them passed into freedom looking eerily like their father. Despite overwhelming evidence, Jefferson's defenders long painted him as a man of moral clarity, but the existence of his secret family unraveled the myth. How could the same man who wrote that all men are created equal simultaneously sustain and exploit an institution that denied basic humanity? To make matters worse, Jefferson kept meticulous records. He noted Hemings's pregnancies on his plantation logs, and her children always seemed to coincide with his stays at Monticello. But what's missing is the acknowledgement. He never admitted the relationship, never spoke their names publicly, and never addressed the glaring contradiction between his politics and his private life. Sally Hemings, for her part, never left any writings. Her voice has been filtered through documents written by men who saw her as property. What little we know of her character comes from the resilience of her children, who went on to build lives as free Americans. In the shadows of Jefferson's Enlightenment ideals lay a secret family, hidden behind shutters, born of silence, and forced to carry both his name and his burden. Benjamin Franklin was a printer, inventor, diplomat, and philosopher, a man of unmatched curiosity and wit. But beyond the lightning rods and bifocals, Franklin had a far more mysterious side, a side filled with shadowy clubs, risque writings, and a social life that would have made most Puritans faint. Let's start with the Hellfire Club. While there's debate over how deep Franklin's involvement ran, he spent years in England during the height of its popularity. The Hellfire Club was a secret society known for hedonism, satire, and irreverence toward religion. Their motto, "Do what thou wilt." It was less about demonic worship and more about scandalous parties in hidden grottos where elite men gathered to drink, gamble, and pursue pleasures both intellectual and physical. Franklin had many such associations. In Paris, while serving as the U.S. ambassador, he was famously fond of French salons, intellectual gatherings that often blurred the line between politics and flirtation. French women adored him, and he adored their company. Letters reveal he was no stranger to romantic dalliances, even in his old age. He once admitted that older women made better lovers, famously writing, "They don't yell, they don't tell, and they're grateful as hell." Yes, the same man whose face adorns the $100 bill wrote that. Franklin also had a fascination with secret codes and pseudonyms. He frequently published under fake names, Mrs. Silence Dogood, Polly Baker, Richard Saunders, creating whole fictional personas to explore taboo topics like religion, sex, and hypocrisy. His writing skewered authority and exposed moral contradictions, but it also hinted at his deeper interests in libertine philosophy and alternative forms of thought. Then there were his personal relationships. Though married to Deborah Reed, Franklin spent many years away from her in Europe. His letters reveal no evidence of fidelity and plenty of warmth toward other women. Some historians even speculate that he may have fathered children abroad, though no claims were ever confirmed. What's clear is that Franklin was a man driven by appetite, intellectual and otherwise. He wasn't bound by the rigid morality of his Puritan ancestors. In fact, he seemed to take pleasure in bending the rules, particularly in matters of sex, power, and thought. So while school books may show us a wise kite-flying inventor, the real Franklin was far more electric, charged with secrecy, mischief, and late-night enlightenment. George Washington is often remembered as a marble statue of a man, stoic, fearless, and impossibly dignified. But beneath the powdered wig and military posture was a deeply private individual with his own share of contradictions, insecurities, and suppressed emotions. Let's start with something most people don't know. Washington was never particularly eager to lead. Before becoming commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, he expressed doubts about his own qualifications. He worried genuinely that he didn't have the experience or skill to lead a war against the British Empire. And even once he accepted, he refused a salary, asking instead for expense reimbursement, possibly to avoid the appearance of ambition. He also struggled with image. Washington obsessed over how others perceived him. He destroyed much of his personal correspondence, particularly letters that might tarnish his legacy. This included potentially romantic letters to Sally Fairfax, the wife of one of his friends, long before Martha. Sally seems to have been the object of Washington's early affections. His letters suggest a deep emotional connection, filled with poetic longing and restrained passion. Speaking of Martha, while their marriage was stable and affectionate, it wasn't romantic in the traditional sense. The two rarely wrote intimate letters, and those that survived show a formal, almost businesslike tone. Martha destroyed nearly all of their personal correspondence after his death, suggesting there were emotions or secrets she didn't want history to know. Then there was the matter of Washington's temper. While he was known for his cool demeanor, his private aides recorded moments of intense rage, especially when things went poorly in battle. He once hurled his hat to the ground and cursed so furiously that soldiers fell silent in shock. These weren't public outbursts, but they reveal the emotional pressure he lived under while presenting a calm, controlled exterior. Washington also owned hundreds of enslaved people, a fact often glossed over in patriotic portrayals. Though he made a show of moral discomfort with slavery and eventually freed some in his will, he still benefited from forced labor throughout his life. Privately, he maneuvered around Pennsylvania's gradual abolition laws by rotating enslaved workers out of state to prevent their legal emancipation. The father of the nation had private doubts, personal regrets, and moral compromises. His greatness was real, but so were his secrets. And in that complexity lies the humanity history so often airbrushes away. Of all the founding fathers, John Adams may have had the sharpest tongue and the tenderest heart. He was brilliant, argumentative, and sometimes insufferable, but behind his stern New England exterior was a man whose most revealing secrets were written, not spoken. And no one received more of those secrets than his wife, Abigail. Their correspondence is one of the most intimate windows into early American political life and into a marriage that was unusually modern for its time. While other founders engaged in affairs, disappeared for years, or buried their personal lives under silence, John and Abigail wrote to each other constantly. Over 1,100 letters survive. In them, Adams poured out his frustrations, fears, political calculations, and deep affection. When John was away in Philadelphia or Europe, Abigail became his advisor, not just his emotional support. He regularly asked her opinion on economic matters, foreign diplomacy, and the behavior of fellow revolutionaries. She, in turn, reminded him to remember the ladies, a plea for women's legal rights that was far ahead of its time. But Adams also had a paranoid streak. He was deeply insecure about his place in history. He resented how much attention Washington and Franklin received and feared he'd be forgotten or overshadowed. After the presidency, he watched with bitterness as Jefferson became the darling of the Republic while he faded into the background. His letters from retirement brim with envy, irritation, and longing for recognition. He also had a famously difficult personality. Adams didn't suffer fools, and in his eyes, most men in government were fools. He feuded with Hamilton, mistrusted Jefferson, and was alienated from nearly every major political faction at some point. His single term as president was marked by controversy, including the Alien and Sedition Acts, which clamped down on press freedom and civil dissent. Yet for all his flaws, Adams never lost his moral compass. He was the only founding father who refused to own slaves on principle, even when it made him politically unpopular and economically disadvantaged. That quiet, uncompromising integrity never made headlines, but it defined him. John Adams wasn't polished, he wasn't worshipped, but he was brutally honest in print, in policy, and in passion. And in those midnight letters to Abigail, he left behind a legacy far more human than heroic. James Madison, the father of the Constitution, is often remembered as the quiet genius of the American Revolution. But behind his modest stature and soft voice was a man battling not only political chaos, but his own failing body and deep insecurities. Standing barely over 5 feet tall and weighing less than 100 pounds, Madison was physically frail for most of his life. He suffered from chronic illnesses, possibly epilepsy, which he kept hidden as best he could. Friends and political allies often noted his ghostly pallor and the sudden spells in which he would disappear from public life to recover. He lived with the fear that he could drop dead from overwork or stress. In fact, Madison was so certain of an early death that he never bothered to write a memoir. He didn't expect to live long enough to matter. But matter he did. Madison was the brain behind the Constitution and one of the primary authors of the Federalist Papers. Yet he rarely took credit. He preferred to work behind the scenes, letting louder personalities like Hamilton and Jefferson take the spotlight. He was the quiet manipulator in the back room, crafting entire systems of government while others shouted on the floor. His marriage to Dolly Madison also reveals much about his private life. Dolly was everything James was not: flamboyant, sociable, magnetic. Their marriage was a power alliance. She made Madison palatable to the public, hosting legendary political salons in Washington, D.C., where enemies became friends, often over her famous ice cream and cakes. While Madison strategized in private, Dolly managed the optics, turning their household into the capital's social center. Yet Madison had his shadows. He was a complex slaveholder, personally uneasy with the institution, but unwilling to free his own enslaved laborers. He even had secret correspondences discussing the logistics of slavery in the new republic, where his ideas, though intellectually cautious, did little to challenge the system. Later in life, Madison struggled with depression and isolation. His political influence waned, and he watched as his vision of limited government was twisted by the very forces he had helped unleash. He may not have had Franklin's charm or Washington's grandeur, but Madison's genius shaped the architecture of the American Republic. And yet, for all his brilliance, he lived and died haunted by doubts, illness, and the fear that history might overlook him. He built the stage, others took the bow. Thomas Paine was the fiery pen behind America's Revolution. His pamphlet, Common Sense, lit the spark that pushed colonists toward independence. Yet unlike the other founding fathers, Paine ended up a political exile, forgotten and despised by the very nation he helped to create. Paine wasn't born into wealth or privilege. He was a working-class Englishman who only arrived in America at age 37, carrying little more than a letter of recommendation from Benjamin Franklin. But in 1776, his writing changed everything. Common Sense sold over 100,000 copies, an astronomical number at the time. It was written in bold, plain language that ordinary people understood. It didn't just call for independence, it demanded it, ridiculing monarchy and championing the idea that government should serve the people. But Paine's revolutionary fervor didn't stop at America's shores. After the U.S. gained independence, he sailed to France and supported the French Revolution. There he wrote The Rights of Man, defending revolution against tyranny. It made him an enemy of the British crown and a hero among French radicals. Yet when the revolution turned bloody, Paine was horrified. He opposed the execution of King Louis XVI, which made him a traitor in the eyes of France's new regime. He was imprisoned in Paris, narrowly escaping the guillotine thanks to a quirk of fate, the chalk mark that mistakenly spared his life. Meanwhile, back in America, Paine's reputation was unraveling. His next major work, The Age of Reason, attacked organized religion and questioned the authority of the Bible. Though he claimed to believe in God, his book was branded as atheist blasphemy. Former friends turned on him. Washington ignored his letters. The Federalists condemned him as dangerous. By the time he returned to the U.S. in 1802, Paine was a pariah. The same man who once ignited a revolution was now mocked in newspapers, denied the right to vote in some states, and shunned by polite society. He died in 1809, poor and alone, buried on a small farm in New York. Only 6 people attended his funeral. Paine's ideas had helped birth a nation, but his unrelenting honesty, refusal to compromise, and attacks on religion cost him everything else. He lit the fuse but was burned by the flame. While most of the founding fathers are remembered for stern portraits and dusty speeches, Gouverneur Morris lived more like a rakish character from a scandalous 18th century novel. He's the man who actually wrote the final draft of the U.S. Constitution, including the iconic preamble, "We the People." But his private life? Anything but textbook. Morris was charismatic, flamboyant, and unapologetically indulgent. He walked with a cane after losing his leg in a mysterious carriage accident, though some whispered it had more to do with jumping from a jealous husband's window than any noble injury. Either way, Morris didn't let it slow him down. In fact, the wooden leg became something of a trademark, just one more thing that made him stand out in the staid world of powdered wigs and rigid protocol. While serving as a diplomat in France during the Revolution, Morris was notorious for his womanizing. He carried on affairs with French aristocrats while chaos engulfed the streets of Paris. One lover was caught in the same revolutionary purge that took Queen Marie Antoinette. Another supposedly helped him escape a mob attack. But Morris wasn't just a libertine. He was an iconoclast. He openly criticized slavery, calling it a nefarious institution, while many of his contemporaries stayed silent or profited from it. He even refused to sign the Constitution unless it protected the federal government's power over slavery, a demand that eventually got watered down. Back home, Morris didn't tone things down. He never married until late in life, instead enjoying a long string of mistresses and scandalous romances that made his colleagues uncomfortable. At age 57, he shocked high society by marrying his housekeeper, Anne Carey Randolph, herself the center of a major scandal involving an alleged abortion and accusations of infanticide. The press had a field day, but Morris didn't care. He was used to being the odd man out. Even his death was unusual. According to legend, Morris attempted to treat a urinary blockage by inserting a whalebone into his urethra, a move that led to fatal internal damage. Whether the story is true or not, it fits the pattern. Morris lived and died on his own terms, often to the astonishment of those around him. In a room full of powdered wigs and moral posturing, Gouverneur Morris was a one-legged, sharp-tongued wild card. and one of the most fascinating figures you've probably never heard of. The Founding Fathers gave birth to a new nation with ideals that promised liberty, justice, and equality. But the private lives they lived often contradicted the very freedoms they so passionately preached. And as the myths of American greatness grew, so too did the willful erasure of their contradictions. Slavery was the most glaring hypocrisy. Many of the men who declared all men are created equal either owned slaves, profited from slavery, or actively defended it. Jefferson, Washington, Madison, Monroe, all slaveholders, even as they debated independence. Enslaved men and women toiled on their plantations, stripped of the rights the Constitution would later promise to protect. Some, like Franklin and Hamilton, took steps toward abolition, but none dismantled the system that made their world possible. Women were another blind spot. Abigail Adams famously urged her husband to remember the ladies as the laws of the new republic were being shaped. He did not. None of them did. The Constitution excluded women entirely. In their private letters, the founders spoke tenderly of their wives and daughters, but legally those women had no rights, no vote, no voice. Then there were the moral double standards. Affairs, illegitimate children, secret societies, and whispered scandals filled their private lives. Yet they wrote about virtue, honor, and restraint. They condemned tyranny abroad while preserving inequality at home. They feared monarchy but allowed dynastic wealth and inherited power to flourish in their new republic. Some were aware of the contradictions. Washington agonized over slavery in his final years. Madison wrote at length about the dangers of factionalism, ironically while building the very political party system he warned against. Others, like Jefferson, seemed capable of compartmentalizing their lives entirely, writing stirring philosophical tracts in the morning and managing enslaved laborers by afternoon. But these flaws don't erase their contributions. They make them human. The Founding Fathers were not gods in togas. They were brilliant, ambitious, flawed men, filled with private weaknesses and public convictions. They built a nation on paradoxes, many of which still haunt America today. Their legacies are not marble statues, but living arguments about freedom, power, morality, and who gets to write history. And in their secret lives, tangled in scandal, contradiction, and compromise, we find not just the origins of a country, but the blueprint of its enduring struggles. Napoleon Bonaparte may have ruled empires and orchestrated historic battles, but when it came to love, he was almost embarrassingly vulnerable. Behind the hardened exterior of a military genius was a man completely disarmed by passion, especially when it came to Josephine de Beauharnais, his first wife and most haunting obsession. Their relationship began as a whirlwind. Josephine, a charming widow 6 years his senior, captivated the young general completely. After a brief courtship, they married in 1796. Almost immediately, Napoleon departed for his Italian campaign, leaving his new bride behind in Paris. From the front lines of war, he began writing letters that reveal not the voice of a conqueror, but that of a love-struck, borderline desperate man. In one letter, he confesses, "I awake full of you. Your image and the memory of last night's intoxicating pleasures have left no rest to my senses." In another, he pleads, "Don't wash, I'm coming home." The letters swing between eroticism, possessiveness, and profound insecurity. Napoleon would win a battle and then immediately sit down to scold Josephine for not writing back quickly enough. He demanded daily letters, interpreting silence as betrayal. His emotions were so volatile that his tone often changed mid-sentence, from romantic longing to bitter accusation. Josephine, meanwhile, was far less enthusiastic. While Napoleon poured out his soul, she enjoyed Parisian salons and eventually took lovers of her own. News of this crushed Napoleon, and his letters began to reflect his heartbreak. Still, even after discovering her infidelity, he couldn't let go. His letters grew darker, more obsessive. He wrote of being tormented, sleepless, consumed. Josephine, for her part, often replied with vague pleasantries or silence. It was a one-sided romance inked in heartbreak. Years later, after divorcing her in 1810 to marry Marie-Louise of Austria for political reasons, Napoleon still carried a torch for Josephine. Even in exile, he reportedly kept a portrait of her near his bed, and on his deathbed at St. Helena, his last words are said to have included her name: France, the army, head of the army, Josephine. For all his power, Napoleon couldn't command love. His letters remain not just historic documents, but confessions of a man undone not by enemy fire, but by a woman who never quite loved him back the way he hoped. Frida Kahlo didn't just paint pain, she wrote it. Her love letters to Diego Rivera, the towering Mexican muralist who was both the love of her life and the source of her deepest wounds, are raw, poetic, and soaked in emotional blood. Where others tried to hide their heartbreak, Frida made hers into art, on canvas and on paper. Frida and Diego's relationship was notoriously turbulent. He was 20 years her senior, a larger-than-life figure with a reputation for infidelity. She was the fiery young artist with a spine fused by injury and a heart prone to volcanic eruptions. Together they were explosive, drawn together by passion, divided by betrayal. Her letters reveal a woman who loved with terrifying intensity. In one, she writes, "Nothing compares to your hands, nothing like the green gold of your eyes. My body is filled with you for days and days." And in another, "I love you more than my own skin." Frida never hid her pain. She bled it out, line by line. She called Diego her frog toad, a loving insult, a nickname that somehow captured both her affection and her frustration. Her letters veer between unconditional love and seething resentment, often within the same paragraph. Even after Diego's affairs, some with Frida's own friends and even her sister, she wrote to him not with detachment, but longing. Her words ask for nothing but presence. "I ask you for violence in the nonsense, and you give me grace, your light, and your warmth." They divorced in 1939. They remarried a year later. Nothing between them was ever stable, but the bond remained unbreakable. Even when they were apart, Frida wrote as if Diego were oxygen, necessary, maddening, and always just out of reach. Her physical suffering also poured into her letters. After her horrific bus accident, which left her with lifelong pain, Frida described her body as a battlefield, one that Diego could not save but somehow made bearable. Her vulnerability was total, but it was never weak. In the end, Frida Kahlo's letters are not just about Diego. They're about the war between love and identity, devotion and survival. Through her pain, she found language. Through her longing, she found fire. And in her fire, she burned herself into history. Ludwig van Beethoven, the brooding genius of classical music, left behind some of the most passionate letters ever written. Though the identity of the woman who inspired them remains one of history's greatest love mysteries, known simply as the immortal beloved, she exists only in a series of letters never sent, found among Beethoven's belongings after his death in 1827. These letters weren't addressed to a name, no date, no return address, just deep, aching declarations of love that baffle and mesmerize scholars to this day. One begins, "My angel, my all, my very self." Another cries, "Though still in bed, my thoughts go out to you, my immortal beloved. Be calm, love me. Today, yesterday, what tearful longing for you. You, my life, my all. Farewell. Oh, continue to love me, never misjudge the most faithful heart of your beloved." Beethoven wasn't known for emotional openness. His letters to others were often curt, formal, even hostile. But in these pages, something shatters. He's vulnerable, intimate, and at times completely unraveled. What's even more haunting is the desperation laced through every word. He wasn't writing from a place of comfort, but of separation. The letters suggest they were apart, perhaps forbidden to be together, caught in circumstances neither could control. He writes of obstacles, of secrecy, of how they cannot be openly united. Scholars have debated the identity of this woman for centuries. The leading candidates include Antony Brentano, a married aristocrat, Josephine Brunswick, a widowed countess, and Therese von Brunswick, a former pupil. Each had deep connections with Beethoven at different times in his life, but none have been confirmed beyond doubt. The puzzle remains incomplete. What is certain is that Beethoven loved deeply, perhaps once, perhaps many times, but this immortal beloved held a singular place in his heart. She was his muse, his torment, his unreachable salvation. And then silence. The letters were never mailed. Perhaps he never dared. Perhaps he never could. Perhaps she was already gone. For a man who composed symphonies that echoed through the ages, it was his unsent letters, full of human longing and wordless grief, that exposed the quietest notes of his soul. His immortal beloved remains unknown, but through his ink, we hear her name in every tragic chord. Oscar Wilde, the celebrated wit of the Victorian era, known for his sharp quips and decadent prose, also penned one of the most devastating love letters in literary history. It wasn't sweet, it wasn't flirty, it was a 50,000-word epistolary howl from a man whose love had destroyed him. Its name, De Profundis, Latin for from the depths. Wilde wrote it while imprisoned in Reading Gaol, serving a 2-year sentence for gross indecency due to his homosexual relationship with Lord Alfred Douglas, a young aristocrat known as Bosie. Their love affair had scandalized society, enraged Douglas's powerful father, and led Wilde from salons and champagne to a prison cell. The letter begins with grief, but it quickly transforms into something more harrowing, a confession, an indictment, a meditation on love and suffering. He writes, "You came to me to learn the pleasure of life and the pleasure of art. Perhaps I am chosen to teach you something much more wonderful, the meaning of sorrow and its beauty." Wilde accuses Douglas of vanity, selfishness, and abandonment, but he never stops loving him. That's the torment. Every paragraph of De Profundis swings between bitterness and longing, betrayal and worship. It's not just a breakup letter, it's a requiem for Wilde's former life. Wilde blames himself too, calling his own indulgence and blindness fatal flaws. He reflects on how he tried to mold Bosie into someone deeper, someone worthy of devotion. Instead, he was consumed. The relationship, he admits, led to his public disgrace, his financial ruin, and the erosion of his genius. But De Profundis is more than a record of heartbreak. It's a philosophical treatise born from suffering. Wilde speaks of Christ as the ultimate artist of sorrow, of how pain creates empathy, and of how prison stripped away every illusion he'd built. He writes, "Where there is sorrow, there is holy ground." After his release, Wilde sent the letter to Douglas, but their bond was beyond repair. Wilde died a few years later, penniless and in exile. De Profundis wasn't published in full until after both men were gone. It is not a love letter in the traditional sense, but it is perhaps the most painfully honest one ever written. Not about desire, but about what love takes when it's done giving. Virginia Woolf, the modernist literary giant known for stream-of-consciousness novels and fierce intellect, had a quiet storm simmering beneath her composed exterior. While married to Leonard Woolf, a steady and supportive partner, she fell deeply and unapologetically in love with another woman, Vida Sackville West, a fellow writer, aristocrat, and free spirit. Their relationship defied categorization. It was emotional, intellectual, romantic, and at times physical. It began in the 1920s and bloomed through a series of letters that remain some of the most lyrically beautiful expressions of same-sex love in literary history. In one of the earliest letters, Woolf writes, "I am reduced to a thing that wants Virginia. It is incredible how essential to me you have become." The roles often reversed. Woolf, usually so guarded, became the one who pined, longed, crumbled. Her letters are full of restrained desire, humor, and subtle desperation. She found in Vita not just a lover, but a muse, a symbol of freedom and bold femininity she both envied and adored. Woolf's masterpiece Orlando was inspired directly by Vita, a fantastical, gender-bending time traveler that embodied the spirit of her elusive love. It was both a literary experiment and a love letter in disguise. Vita, in return, adored Virginia, though her affections were often scattered. She had other lovers, other intrigues, and her own complicated marriage. Yet her letters to Woolf showed deep admiration and enduring attachment. "I miss you even more than I could have believed, and I was prepared to miss you a good deal." What makes their correspondence so extraordinary is the way it dances around conventions. These were not declarations shouted from rooftops. These were whispers across pages, intimate, coded, and infused with longing that transcended physicality. Even after their romantic relationship cooled, they remained close, exchanging letters until Woolf's suicide in 1941. One of her last letters, addressed to Leonard, her husband, is often quoted, but it is her letters to Vita that contain her rawest joy, her vulnerability laid bare in ink. In a world that tried to define love rigidly, Woolf and Vita wrote their own rules. Their letters weren't just about love, they were love, complicated, beautiful, impossible to label, and like the tides of Woolf's own prose, always in motion. John Keats, the romantic poet who gave us lines like, "A thing of beauty is a joy forever," lived a life tragically short but emotionally overwhelming. He died at just 25, But in his final years, he poured out his soul in letters to the woman he adored, Fanny Brawne. Their romance was filled with intensity, poetry, and dread. Keats, already sick with tuberculosis, knew he was living on borrowed time. He fell for Fanny hard and fast, and though they were secretly engaged, he knew he would likely never live to marry her. That looming mortality saturates every word he wrote to her. One of his letters reads, "I have been astonished that men could die martyrs for religion. I have shuddered at it. I shudder no more. I could be martyred for my religion. Love is my religion. I could die for that. I could die for you." Keats didn't just love Fanny, he worshipped her. His letters are filled with torment, beauty, jealousy, and devotion. He longed for her presence so deeply it hurt him physically. He called her his goddess, his bright star, and even in moments of insecurity, he clung to her image like a lifeline. But his illness made everything more desperate. He feared being a burden. He feared she might stop loving him. And most of all, he feared he'd die without ever truly knowing her as a husband would. That fear, that burning sadness, makes the letters unbearably tender. In another letter he writes, "I almost wish we were butterflies and lived but 3 summer days. 3 such days with you I could fill with more delight than 50 common years could ever contain." Fanny kept his letters for the rest of her life, though she rarely spoke of him afterward. When Keats died in Rome in 1821, he was buried beneath a stone that bore no name, only the inscription, "Here lies one whose name was writ in water." But his name did not wash away, his poetry endured, and so did his letters to Fanny. Pages soaked in yearning, preserved against the odds, reminders that even in the shadow of death, love can still burn brilliantly. John Keats didn't get a lifetime, but he left behind a love that reads like eternity. Emily Dickinson, one of America's most enigmatic poets, lived much of her adult life in seclusion, rarely leaving her home in Amherst, Massachusetts. But behind her reclusive exterior and cryptic verses was a deep, passionate, emotional world, one that found expression in letters as mysterious as her poetry. Her most intense correspondences were addressed to a figure she called Master. These 3 letters, never sent, never named, reveal a woman wrestling with overwhelming love and existential longing. She writes, "Master, open your life wide and take me in forever, but I shall never be satisfied with never." The identity of Master has never been confirmed. Some believe it was Charles Wadsworth, a married preacher she admired. Others suggest it may have been a composite, a symbolic lover, or even an expression of divine yearning. Whatever the truth, the letters are unmistakably intimate, tender, erotic, aching with restrained desire. Dickinson also carried on emotionally charged relationships with women, especially Susan Huntington Gilbert Dickinson, her sister-in-law and next-door neighbor. Over 300 letters to Susan survive, filled with romantic language, poetic flirtation, and declarations that blur the line between deep friendship and romantic love. She wrote to Susan, "Susie, will you indeed come home next Saturday and be my own again and kiss me? I hope for you so much and feel so eager for you, feel that I cannot wait, feel that now I must have you." These weren't casual notes, they were floods of feeling composed in slanted, swirling handwriting. Dickinson never married, and her emotional life remained largely invisible during her lifetime. But her letters reveal someone with a fierce capacity to love intensely, secretly, and poetically. It's no coincidence that many of her greatest poems mirror the tone of her letters, the aching, the obsession, the sacred terror of intimacy. Her words move like riddles, wrapping love in layers of metaphor and punctuation dashes. Emily Dickinson lived behind closed doors, but she loved in wide, sweeping sentences. Her letters, fragmented, half-lost, often coded, invite readers into a hidden realm of affection too powerful to be publicly declared. In a world that feared women's emotions, Dickinson buried hers in verse and in ink, trusting perhaps that someday someone would find them and understand. Winston Churchill is often remembered for his unshakable wartime leadership, rousing speeches, and eternal scowl. But behind the bulldog bravado was a man deeply devoted to his wife, Clementine Hozier, a relationship preserved in a remarkable series of love letters that spanned more than 5 decades. From the moment they met in 1904, Winston was smitten. Their courtship was brief, just 4 months, and the letters began almost immediately. Even as bombs fell and empires crumbled, Churchill took time to write to Clementine. His tone, usually fierce and forceful in public, turned soft and playful in private. In one letter he wrote, "My darling Clem, I hope you will forgive me for writing you such a short letter, but really, I am so busy running the British Empire, I have scarcely time to keep my head on." His humor never left him, even under the pressure of World War. During their long marriage, Churchill was often away on military campaigns, in Parliament, or commanding the nation. But his letters were constant, and his affection never seemed to wane. He called her his cat and signed letters as Pug, a nod to their nicknames for one another. They wrote not just as husband and wife, but as lifelong friends, confidantes, and emotional anchors. But they weren't always in harmony. One of Clementine's most famous letters, written in 1940 during the height of the war, gently warned Winston that he was becoming short-tempered with his staff. She wrote not to scold him, but to help him remain the leader Britain needed. His response, grateful and open, he listened. Their letters balance flirtation and strategy, tenderness and tension. Churchill once told Clementine that meeting her had conquered and captured him more completely than any battlefield. Even near the end of his life, he continued to write her loving notes, often brief, always heartfelt. In a world of war rooms and command centers, Churchill found his truest peace in the quiet of a letter to his wife. No pomp, no politics, just devotion. His legacy may be forged in speeches and victories, but the love letters to Clementine remind us that even history's hardest men often live their softest truths in private. Few love stories in literary history are as dazzling or as destructive as that of Zelda and F. Scott Fitzgerald. They were the golden couple of the jazz age, sparkling through the roaring 20s with martinis in hand, madness on the horizon, and a pile of love letters trailing behind them like confetti from a broken parade. Their romance began in 1918, when Scott was a young army officer and Zelda was a wild Southern belle with a rebellious streak. He courted her with letters full of ambition, wit, and desperation. "I love you the first moment I saw you, and I'll love you until my last breath." She kept him dangling at first, unsure if his literary dreams would amount to anything. But when his first novel, This Side of Paradise, became a hit in 1920, she agreed to marry him. They were rich, young, famous, and completely unprepared. Their letters reflect a manic love. In one, Zelda wrote, "Scott, my darling, I've just washed my hair and I can't do a thing with it, but I love you madly." Her notes are playful, poetic, flirtatious, and often laced with her own growing instability. Scott's replies were both adoring and possessive. He admired her beauty and spirit, but feared her independence. When Zelda tried to write, dance, or express herself artistically, he often dismissed her, insisting there could only be one writer in the family. That tension bled into their letters, affection tangled with control. As the years passed, their glittering lifestyle spiraled into alcoholism, financial ruin, and mutual resentment. Zelda suffered a series of mental breakdowns and spent long stretches in sanitariums. Yet even then, their letters retained a strange, aching tenderness. From an asylum, Zelda once wrote, "I've tried so many ways of writing to you. I've tried to tell you how much I believe in you, but words aren't right. They just aren't." Scott died in 1940, thinking himself a failure. Zelda perished in a fire at her hospital 8 years later. But their letters, those wild burning fragments, survive. They show two people who loved like firecrackers, explosive, beautiful, and ultimately doomed. A love too big for the world they lived in, preserved forever in ink and ash.